at the brink of the Jordan before the Israelites are going to go in and conquer the land of Canaan. Joshua is about to take over because Moses is going to die at the end of this book, and he's not going to be able to go to the promised land. Joshua's going to come through, and he's going to begin these conquests. But they're standing at the brink of the Jordan, and they're getting this pep talk and a reminder of where have we come from. Go back and think about what it looked like when we were in Egypt, when we were suffering, when we were going through all of these things. And think about how God has led us and how he has given us his teachings along the way. And here you stand at the brink of the Jordan, and you're about to cross over, and I'm giving you a warning. When you cross over and when you do what I tell you to do, Lord willing, by his plan and his will, what we're talking about here, that you will be successful. But be warned, if you go outside of those parameters, you go outside those plans, it's going to be very hard for you. God's telling his people, I'm sending you into a land where the houses are prepared for you. The vineyards are ripe for the picking, where everything that you need for sustenance is going to be provided for you if you will just stay the course and you don't veer left to right. And in all of these teachings, as Moses is recounting all of this in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is also establishing the offices that they're going to be able to respect and they're going to see over Israel. He's going to talk about prophets. He's going to talk about priests. He's going to talk about judges. But he's also going to talk about kings. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, starting in verse 14, even before they go into the promised land, this is the teaching that is given to them. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Isn't this interesting? Before we get to 1 Samuel chapter 8, before we get to the time of the judges, before we get to the time of Joshua, Moses, by God, is being given this commandment. When you come into the land and you make this request, make sure I'm reigning over you. Make sure I'm the one that chooses. This tells us something. We have theological parameters from God to identify what a king should be. And then he's going to give them some teaching. He said, when you have that king, make sure he's not a foreigner. Make sure he doesn't get a lot of wives, a lot of possessions. And already you can see Solomon failing in this. You can see Saul failing in this. You can see David's heart even in this. And there's a difference of what's going on here. You have the theological parameters of God saying, you're going to ask for this, but make sure I'm over you. But then when you read 1 Samuel chapter 8, why is God upset? It's because they're wanting a king for political reasons, not for God's reasons. And that's where they're going to get in trouble. Because they're going to have kings that are going to rule over them that have hearts set on men and their desires instead of on what God wants. I think this is so interesting as we study 1st and 2nd Kings. You're going to be able to identify exactly what we're seeing in Deuteronomy chapter 17 and what we're seeing in 1 Samuel chapter 8. You're going to see people falling away from God because their hearts are not where they need to be. And this is why we find ourselves in the story. This is where we find our heart aching with them and seeing this is what it looks like to be away from God. So this is a bit of an introduction of just thinking about how are we even going to study this and why should we study it. It's going to pull at your heart, and I hope that it does because God has designed it that way. And he's told us this is the way it's going to operate. If you go to Romans chapter 15, verse 4. Paul, who is well versed in the Old Testament, he tells us this. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. Don't dismiss it just because we're intimidated by it. Grasp it, wrestle with it, and appreciate it. Wrestle with it and appreciate it. He also tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul writing to the church, these books that we learn from, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6, he says, now these things took place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. And he's going to talk about a lot of episodes from the Old Testament. Take the challenge. and be ready to dive into it. And if I can provide the tools to help us navigate some of the complexities of the language and how it's designed so that we can get straight to the heart of the book and of these men and these women and ourselves, I think we will all benefit greatly from this study. So consider it in that way. And now, with these things established, let's dive into a different aspect of it so that we can continue to orient ourselves in a little bit more of the technical side of what this book is all about. Now, I think it's important to look at timelines, as you can tell by my structure of what I've got going on here. But if you think about just things that have happened in history building up to this point, when you think about 1000 BC, so 1,000 years before Jesus comes on the scene, 3,000 years before where we are right now, what did the world look like? We've got some students and we've got some of our kids that are part of what's called Classical Conversations. It's a homeschooling group, and one of the things that they do in that group is that they have a 15-minute song. Okay, they've got it all mapped out in a song, but it recounts all of history. Like I said, it's 15 minutes that these kids memorize, and they can go through the entire history of the world by century and major event. And some of the facts that I have taken from that timeline that my daughter's working on, and we have a lot of other families here that do the same thing, that can do the whole 15 minutes. We're working on the first part. These are things that are leading up to, in our timeline, 1000 BC, okay? Here's some things that are going to come along, and if I put them up there, you'll appreciate it as well. So here's our timeline. So you think about the 7 wonders of the ancient world. When they were first being constructed, 2500 BC. The patriarchs of Israel, so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that starts in 2100. So just put that Abraham was 1,000 plus years before the time of the kings. You know, I don't know, when you read through the Old Testament, I don't know if this is where I get challenged of, all right, how can I really put this on a timeline and think about what else is going on in the world and how much time has passed? This is why I'm wanting to do this. These are just some facts to consider, okay? The Assyrians they begin to percolate 900 years before this. The Assyrians are going to be the ones that are going to drag off the Israelites into exile. The Babylonians are percolating at the same time and becoming a nation that's going to wipe out the Assyrians. The Exodus happened over 500 years before this. Exodus happened about 1440, somewhere around in there, or 1040. Yeah. And you got the Israelite conquest coming right after that. The pyramids of Egypt are 1,500 years old at this point. I just always think that's interesting. When you think about Moses in Egypt and all the labor that they were going through, a lot of times I don't know, it's just probably me. I think about the Israelites building the pyramids when they're in Egypt. Well, that's not the case at all. By the time we get to the Kings, those things are 1,500 years old. And it was only 500 years before that the Exodus happened. So when the Israelites were in Egypt, those pyramids were 1,000 years old. You ever think about history that way? Do you ever consider that's how much time has passed and what things look like on that landscape? The United Kingdom begins around 1025, as we talked about. You got the early Native Americans that have already been in this land, started in that land around that same time. Israel dividing is what we're going to be getting to in this. That's going to be in 931. The writings of Homer and Hesiod, and Rome was founded about halfway through what we're going to be looking at here. Israel's going to fall to Assyria, and Assyria falls to Babylon. You've got Buddha and Confucius and all these other philosophers that are all across the world. All of these things are going to be happening in this time frame. I look at this book, 1st and 2nd Kings, but I guess I really look at the Old Testament as a whole, and I'm challenged by just how it fits into time in history. Appreciate these facts for what they are and how it helps us orient ourselves even in the timeline of what's going on here. And you'll actually see how much time passes very quickly as we're reading this. I don't know, I just think that's interesting, and I hope you appreciate that as well. So as we read this book, there's some different wordings that are going to come out that shows us a little bit of how 1st and 2nd Kings were put together. Now, let's look at Luke chapter 1. We're talking about the Old Testament, but we can talk about the New Testament as well, right? If you look at Luke chapter 1, think about how Luke constructed his gospel account. All right, so we know between the 4 gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew was an apostle. John was an apostle. Mark clearly spent some time around the apostles, but he himself was not one of them. Luke, we know as one of the travel companions of Paul himself. And as you read through the book of Acts, you can find Luke in the narrative when he starts speaking in the first person plural. We went over here and we did that. But there's other times where he shares these stories that he is not located in at all. The way that Luke is compiling information and writing this is going to be similar to what we're seeing in 1 Kings. Here's what I mean by that. Look at Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Luke, as the physician, as someone who is well educated, he's trying to tell us the story about Jesus. He said, look, I've interviewed eyewitnesses. In the book of Acts, he's going to say something very similar. He said, I was there in some of these situations, and I heard what Paul said. I was there at the church when this person came by and told this kind of thing. You know, you think about these individuals by inspiration of God working with what is given to them, and they are trying to show us something. He's trying to show us an orderly account so that we can understand Jesus and what he taught. We need to ask the question, what are we getting from 1st and 2nd Kings? And what are they drawing on to help us understand that a little bit better? I'm going to show some verses, and I've got a lot more that are written in here for you to think about. But as you read through the book, there's going to be these times where it explains the kings and what they did, and it shows where they're getting their information. Some of the things are going to come from the book of Chronicles of Judah. Now, if you're going to put 1st and 2nd Kings together with another book, it's going to be 2nd Chronicles. They're going to share some stories together, and some of them are going to have different ones. But I think this is interesting. Let's read some of these examples. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 31, just to illustrate what I'm talking about here. 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 31. Now the rest of the acts of Nadab and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? As this man is looking at the history, whoever is writing this during this time, and we don't have an author attached to it, probably Ezra or somebody along those lines, he's collecting information about what we know concerning these people, their reputation, and what they did. And it seems like there was this book, there are these collections of teachings where they're talking about what these kings did. And he's saying, look, what I've recorded to you is for a purpose, but man, there's a lot more you can learn from these people. You know, think about when John writes his gospel account. At the very end, what does he say? If I were to record every single thing that Jesus did or said or taught, the world could not contain the books. There's so much that has happened in human history, and you can see God's plan all along the way and his hand involved, but then there's sections where we don't know anything. You think about the years of biblical silence from Malachi to Matthew, those 400 years where we don't know what God was doing, but we can find times where God was certainly active, and I think about stories like Esther and things along those lines. It helps me as I'm reading 1 Kings that whoever's putting this together for our understanding with God, inspiring them, that they're showing us, look, I'm trying to lead you to a conclusion. And so they're talking about these different kings from Judah, but you're also going to have these different kings of Israel as well. An example would be, let's see, 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 29, just to back up a chapter. Now the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So the first one we had the king. Sorry, I messed those up. I flip-flopped them in my mind. But you can see where it talks about these things that Israel did, these things that Judah did, and they're collecting all of them so that we may be encouraged. And here's what you're going to find in them. Some of these descriptions you're reading through, and so this is where you'd want to highlight in your Bible where it says, are these things also written in this book? It's going to talk about all that they did, their actions. And we can learn from people's actions, right? It talks about all of their mighty deeds. We're going to see that these individuals were able to conquer some very strong enemies. They were able to build some awesome buildings and things along these lines. We can learn from that. We're also going to learn about how they fought certain kings, even among their own people, between Israel and Judah together. You're going to learn about conspiracies that were formed. You're going to learn how they built the temple itself. You're going to learn how they restored certain things as well. All of these things are given to us in this book. So if you want to think about it historically, you can find where it matches in time. But if you just want to think about what these people did, you're going to get some teachings about them. And so as we put all of this together, as you read through, and this is just a little challenge because I like having challenges when I read. A lot of times we sit down with the Bible, we just do a linear fashion, and we go right through, and then we get to the end of it, and we think, what in the world did I get from that? I don't know if you felt that way in some of the scripture readings that we've been doing together. It's like, okay, we're going to read through the book of Mark. Okay, I've read through the book of Mark before, but sitting there and somebody's reading it, you find different things. Maybe if you have a goal or an objective, you'll be able to recognize them as well. And so you get all these different things. You get the book of the Deed of Solomon that are also mentioned. It seems like, we know about his reputation, and there's certainly a lot of information about him. But we also get these tales of the prophets. When there's a king, there's going to be a prophet. And that tells us something about how God operates, doesn't it? If someone's going to be in charge, he's going to have someone right there telling them what to do, keeping them on track. I think it's interesting, back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, one of the things the kings were supposed to do was to make their own copy of the law. Not to interpret it, not to come up with their bullet points. They were to take God's old law, the law of Moses, and they were to handwrite their own copy of it. Now, what would that do for us if we sat down and said, you know what, I'm going to write out all of Matthew? You think you would have a better appreciation, a better knowledge of what's in there? Not only do they have their own copy if they actually did that according to God's plans, but they have someone like the troubler of Israel, Elijah, that comes along. You learn about Elijah, you learn about Elisha and these big figures, but there's also individuals that pop up along the way that are just mentioned as maybe a man of God. Maybe it's Isaiah that we have other books composed by him. Maybe it's somebody that you just get and you just find out their name is Huldah and that's it. Look for people that pop up in the story that fit these different categories. And as you put all four of these together, you learn a lot about the book of Kings. And when you compare it to 2 Chronicles, just if you want an extra tip, if you go to 2 Chronicles, look at some of the same kind of things. You're going to have in Chronicles, it's going to talk about the book of the kings of Israel. It's going to talk about the Chronicles of the kings of Judah. It's going to tell the story of the kings. It's going to talk about the book of kings of Judah and Israel all together. It's going to have the writings of Nathan the prophet, Gad the seer, Ahijah from Silo, Edo the seer, Shemaiah the prophet, Jehu, Hananiah, the prophet Isaiah, the Chronicles of the seers, and royal records. It shows us who these people are as they're writing. I understand that may be a little bit more technical, and you look and you say, okay, Billy, that's fine to understand, but what does that have to do? It's adding to our appreciation for what God is trying to accomplish as we're looking at this. And I understand as we think about the application of it, but also like the technical part as well. When we talk about these kings, these are going toward our fast facts. Let's just stop and consider all of the kings of just Israel. Now, we're gonna explain a couple of weeks why there's a divide when we talk about Israel versus Judah. These are two different dynasties, two different groups, okay? We talk about the kings of Israel. Look at the number of kings. And we're looking in our timeline of just 500 years. It's actually less than that. In 500 years, all of these kings are going to reign. And you're going to learn their stories and how they become kings. And I want you to compare this, all right? Think about this for a second. If you're going to break down how they became a king and who their father was, this is what it looks like. Pick up on this. So I've got the king, I've got how they came to the throne and who their father was. And so each time a new king comes to the throne that is dissociated with the one before them, we're going to call it a new dynasty. Now just a quick look at this, and this is only half. I've got 2 slides showing it. What do you notice about how these people become kings? What's the reoccurring theme? The top, right below each one of these dynasties. You've got assassinations. So you've got this guy, and maybe his son is going to be in charge, and then his grandson's going to be in charge, but then he gets assassinated, and somebody else is going to come in, and they're going to be in charge. Not related by family at all. Or maybe it's a group of people like the army. They're going to come in and say, you know what? We hate what is going on over here, and we want someone else in charge. So they said, we're going to promote you, and now you're the king. And here's the second set. And you can see something very similar. You got longer dynasties like this, but each time there's an assassination or there's a coup, there's no consistency, is there? These people, out of anger or pride or malice or greed or whatever, they're becoming kings. Now let's stop and compare the kings of Judah. What do we know as one of the major promises that God gave to David concerning his throne? What is it? He'll last forever. He will always have someone sit on the throne. And we know the fulfillment of that is when Jesus comes. As you go through Judah, so you're watching, as we're reading through, you're going to say, and this was a king of Judah, this was a king of Israel. Israel's got all their stuff going on over here. Judah, it's going to be one son after the other, after the other, after the other. And some of them are going to do really well. Some of them are going to do poorly. Some of them are going to learn from their fathers of what to do and what not to do. I just think it's so interesting for us, if you were to compare this group of kings, and that's a lot of them as well, right? But how they relate to David. And if you put him at the top as a man after God's own heart, that becomes an ideal. And here's what's going to happen as you read through these guys. And I've got a few different timelines and things. I'll pull these back up just for you. But this is showing them on a more extended timeline. And I'll have to work on the colors for all of us. But that's all of them on one, okay? That's going to have Judah and Israel together. I just want to stop and think about the influence of these people. As you read about these men, they're going to fall in two different classes. He did right in the eyes of the Lord, or he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. As you begin reading, and I hope you're prompted to read these books before our next time together, find those phrases. Find where these men are described as following good reputations and good people. I think about this phrase, he did right in the eyes of the Lord. This only applies to 10 kings of Israel, including initially Solomon. Of all those lists, 10 of them are described as doing right in the eyes of the Lord. There's some other qualifiers that are attached to it. Some of them did right as David had done. What an honor that is. It's one to be considered, well done, my good and faithful servant. You have done what is right. It's another thing, man, you look like David. Sometimes these people are, they're said that they have done right in spite of the people who have come before them, their fathers. So you have done right in spite of what this person or that person has done. The verdict of doing right implies that the reader would recognize that the king was being measured against the standard of God's divine law and God's covenant with his people. It's not something arbitrary that we get to come up with. It's going to say this king did what was right because he knocked down the idols. He destroyed these enemies, or he removed all of this false practice, and he did this and he did that. It's by God's standard that we saw in Deuteronomy 17, 1 Samuel chapter 8. That's what classifies them. And on the flip side of that, when you think about those who did evil in the eyes of God, they're going to look like someone else. They're going to do just as evil deeds as Jeroboam did. And we'll find out what his problem was. We're going to find their false worship, and we're going to find detestable practices, and them rebuilding high places and erecting altars and practicing astrology and introducing non-God characteristic features. So as we finish this study, and I know that was the final bell, putting this one thing up as we're ending, sorry. Here's what I want you to look for in questions to ask. What can we get from this? What are we going to see? I hope you learn a lot about yourself, about God's plan, and his will for us. So appreciate you guys. I know it was a little bit of a crunch on some of this, but I look forward to expanding it further later.